Welcome to this journey through one of Appalachia's most haunting legends, a story that exists in the shadowy space between memory and myth, between history and folklore. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this fictional tale will move you in ways that blur the line between what we fear and what we know to be true. We're about to delve into a legend that has been whispered around fires in the mountains of eastern Kentucky for generations, where a schoolhouse that may or may not have existed became the center of a narrative so disturbing that communities chose to let it fade into the mist rather than preserve it in written record. This is not history. This is not true crime. This is something older, a story that lives in the collective imagination of a place, a cautionary tale that speaks to deeper truths about isolation, secrets, and the darkness that can grow when communities turn inward. It was the year 1943. The Second World War was consuming the world's attention, drawing young men from even the most remote corners of America to fight on distant shores. In the mountains of eastern Kentucky, in valleys so remote they seemed to exist outside of time itself, the situation was different. There, the war felt like something happening in another universe entirely, a distant thunder that never quite reached the hollows where generations had lived and died without ever seeing the world. Beyond the ridges, this is a work of fiction, a legend, a ghost story, if you will. But like all enduring legends, it carries within it kernels of psychological truth about human nature, about what happens when fear takes root in isolated places, about how communities deal with unspeakable. The legend speaks of a place called Hollow Creek, a name that appears on no official maps, in no census records, in no archives of the Kentucky Historical Society. Whether it ever truly existed, or is simply a composite of dozens of similar mountain communities, is impossible to say. But in the telling, Hollow Creek becomes real. In the imagining, it lives. Picture, if you will, a valley so narrow that sunlight reached the bottom for only a few hours each day, even in the height of summer. The creek that gave the hollow its name ran swift and cold, fed by springs that never froze even in the depths of January. Along this creek, scattered like seeds that had fallen in infertile soil, stood perhaps a dozen cabins rough, hewn structures built from chestnut and oak, their roofs covered in split shingles that had weathered to the color of smoke. The people who lived here, let us call them the Hollow folk, were descended from Irish settlers who had pushed into these mountains in the 1700s, seeking land and isolation in equal measure. By 1943, they had achieved both. They spoke with accents that preserved linguistic patterns from centuries past, used words that had disappeared from standard English before the Revolutionary War, and lived according to customs and beliefs that would have seemed alien even to other Appalachians living just 20 miles away over the ridges. There were no roads into Hollow Creek, no telephone lines, no electricity. The nearest town, let us call it Grayson Falls, lay 12 miles distant as the crow flies, but nearly 20 miles by the winding trail that climbed up and over the ridge. In winter, when snow fell deep and ice glazed the rocks, the hollow was completely cut off. Families would go months without seeing anyone from outside their small community. In the center of the hollow, where the valley widened slightly and the creek made a gentle bend, stood the schoolhouse. It was a simple structure, one room, built from logs that had been squared with broad axes and fitted together with such skill that little chinking was needed between them. The roof was steeper than those of the cabins necessary to shed the heavy snows. There were 4 windows, 2 on each long side, fitted with actual glass panes that had been carried in on mule, back from Grayson Falls years before. The door faced east, toward the sunrise, according to tradition. Inside, the schoolhouse contained what you might expect: rough benches that served as desks, a teacher's desk made from planks, a blackboard painted directly onto one wall, a wood stove that stood in the corner like a black iron sentinel. The walls were decorated with the things children make drawings on salvaged paper: letters of the alphabet traced in careful hands, a map of the United States that was already years out of date, showing only 48 states. This was where the children of Hollow Creek came to learn their letters and numbers, to hear stories of the world beyond the mountains, to prepare, theoretically, for lives that might take them beyond the narrow valley where they'd been born. According to the legend, in the autumn of 1943, a new teacher came to Hollow Creek. Her name, in the various tellings, changes. Sometimes she is called Sarah, sometimes Margaret. Sometimes she has no name at all, existing only as the teacher, or the stranger woman. For our purposes, let us call her Miss Evelyn Marsh, a name that sounds right for the time and place, though it carries no more historical weight than any other fiction. Miss Marsh was said to be from Lexington, a city that might as well have been Paris or London for how foreign it seemed to the Hollow folk. She was young, perhaps 23 or 24, and had been educated at what was then called a normal school, an institution designed to train teachers for rural areas. Whether she came to Hollow Creek by choice, seeking adventure and the romance of teaching in the mountains, or whether she had been assigned there by some county board of education that may or may not have had jurisdiction over this isolated place, the legend does not say. What the legend does preserve, in all its versions, is the description of her arrival. She came in September, when the leaves were just beginning to turn, and the air carried the first hint of the cold that would soon lock the hollow in winter's grip. She rode a mule, her possessions packed in 2 canvas bags slung over the animal's back. The trail from Grayson Falls had taken her an entire day to traverse, and she arrived in the late afternoon when shadows were already filling the valley like dark water. The Hollow folk watched her come. They stood in their doorways, silent and assessing, as she made her way down the final stretch of trail toward the cluster of cabins. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, eyes wide at the sight of this stranger with her modern clothes and city ways. The schoolhouse had been standing empty for 2 years. The previous teacher, an elderly man who had taught the Hollow children for decades, had died during the winter of 1941. Since then, the children had gone without formal schooling, learning what they could from parents who were themselves barely literate. Miss Marsh dismounted in front of the schoolhouse. The building seemed solid enough, though the windows were dusty and the steps zagged slightly. She tied her mule to a post and turned to face the handful of men who had approached, the fathers, the decision-makers, the ones who would determine whether she was acceptable. "I'm here to teach," she said. Her voice, according to the legend, was clear and firm, showing no trace of the fear she must have felt. The eldest of the men, let us call him Jonah's Riddle, a name that fits the Gothic nature of our tale, looked her up and down. He was perhaps 60, lean and weathered, with eyes that seemed to look through rather than at things. "You're young," he said, not hostile but stating fact. "I'm qualified," she replied. "I have my certificate. I've taught for 2 years in Harlan County." Harlan County. That meant something even here. Harlan was mining country, rough and violent, a place where young teachers learned quickly or left. If she had survived 2 years there, perhaps she could manage Hollow Creek. Jonah's Riddle nodded slowly. "Schoolhouse is yours," he said. "We'll fix the chimney before frost. You'll take your meals with different families, turn about. There's a room in back where the last teacher slept." And so it was decided. Miss Evelyn Marsh became the teacher of Hollow Creek. The first weeks passed peacefully, according to the legend. Miss Marsh settled into her room at the back of the schoolhouse, a small space with a narrow bed, a chair, and a table. She took her meals with the families of the hollow, moving from cabin to cabin according to a schedule that had been established generations before. The food was simple but plentiful: cornbread and beans, salt pork, occasionally a chicken, wild greens gathered from the woods, preserves made from blackberries and pawpaws. The children came to school. There were 13 of them, ranging in age from 6 to 15. 13, an unlucky number, as the legend never fails to mention. They were quiet children, respectful, but there was something in their eyes that troubled Miss Marsh. They watched her with an intensity that seemed inappropriate for their years, as if they were constantly assessing her, measuring her against some standard she could not comprehend. She taught them their letters. She taught them arithmetic. She read to them from the few books she had brought tales of far-off places, stories of American history, poems that spoke of beauty and truth. But as the weeks passed and October turned to November, Miss Marsh began to notice things that disturbed her. The children never played. During the brief recesses when she sent them outside to run and breathe fresh air, they stood in silent clusters, whispering to one another in a dialect so thick she could barely understand it. They watched the woods that surrounded the hollow with an alertness that seemed more appropriate to hunted animals than to children. They never spoke of their families beyond basic facts. When she asked about their fathers, their mothers, their siblings, they answered in monosyllables and quickly changed the subject. And they were afraid, not of her. She sensed no fear directed toward her person, but they were afraid of something. It permeated the schoolhouse like the cold that seeped through the log walls. It was in the way they glanced toward the windows when the wind blew. It was in the way they hurried home as soon as she dismissed them, practically running up the trail toward their cabins. Miss Marsh tried to speak with the parents about her concerns during her evening meals in their homes, but she met only silence or deflection. Children are different here. They would say, mountain ways, you wouldn't understand. She wrote letters to friends in Lexington describing her unease, but she had no way to post them. The mail carrier came to the hollow only once a month, and his next visit would not be until December. The legend marks the beginning of November as the turning point, the moment when unease blossomed into genuine fear. It started with the youngest child, a girl of 6 named, let us say, Ruth. She had been absent from school for 3 days. On the 4th day, Miss Marsh asked about her. Where is Ruth? She inquired of Ruth's older brother, a boy of 9 named Thomas. Thomas stared at his desk. Sick, he mumbled. What kind of sick? Thomas did not answer. That evening, Miss Marsh took her meal with a family named Calhoun. She asked about Ruth. The child has a fever. Mrs. Calhoun said, her voice flat, she'll be fine. Should I visit her? Miss Marsh asked. I could bring her schoolwork, read to her. No. The word came sharp and final. No strangers in the house when there's sickness. Miss Marsh let the matter drop, but she felt the wrongness of it in her bones. 2 days later, Ruth returned to school. She was pale and quiet, quieter than usual, if such a thing were possible. When Miss Marsh gently examined her, she found faint bruises on the child's upper arms, as if someone had gripped her tightly. Ruth would not meet her eyes. She would not speak of her absence. Then Samuel, a boy of 11, disappeared for a week. When he returned, he limped slightly, favoring his left leg. Miss Marsh questioned him, but he mumbled something about falling in the woods and would say no more. November deepened. The days grew shorter, the cold more intense. Frost glittered on the windows each morning, and Miss Marsh could see her breath inside the schoolhouse, until the stove had been burning for an hour. And the children grew stranger still. They began to whisper among themselves constantly, their heads bent close together, their voices too low for her to hear. When she approached, they would fall instantly silent, watching her with eyes that held something she could not name. Not hostility, not fear of her, something else, something like pity. One morning in mid-November, Miss Marsh found something on her desk when she arrived to open the schoolhouse. It was a small cloth doll, crudely made, with button eyes and yarn hair. It had been placed carefully in the center of her desk, positioned as if it were sitting there, watching the room. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. The stitching was careful, the work of someone who knew needle and thread. But there was something disturbing about it. The way the button eyes seemed to stare, the way the mouth had been stitched in a line that might have been a smile, or might have been something else entirely. Who left this? She asked the children when they arrived. Silence. This is my desk. Nothing should be placed here without my permission. Still silence. But the children exchanged glances, quick as birds, and in those glances Miss Marsh read something that chilled her more than the November cold. They knew who had left the doll, and they were terrified. That night, taking her evening meal with the Riddle family, Jonas and his wife Martha and their 3 children, Miss Marsh tried once more to understand what was happening. "Jonas," she said carefully, "I've been teaching here for 2 months now. I feel the children trust me, or at least they're beginning to, but there's something wrong. They're afraid of something, and I need to know what it is so I can help them." Jonas Riddle ate his beans slowly, methodically. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes held that same expression she had seen in the children's faces. Not hostility, not fear, pity. "Miss Marsh," he said slowly, "there are things in these mountains that outsiders don't understand, ways that have been kept for generations. We appreciate you coming here to teach our young uns, we truly do. But there's things that aren't your concern, things you're better off not knowing. But the children will be fine." Martha Riddle interrupted, her voice firm. "They've always been fine. Their parents before them were fine. It's the way of things." Miss Marsh felt her frustration rising. "If someone is hurting these children, no one is hurting them," Jonas said, and there was steel in his voice now. "But they're learning what they need to know to survive here, learning the old ways, the necessary ways." "What old ways? What are you talking about?" Jonas stood, the conversation clearly over. "You teach them their letters, Miss Marsh. You teach them their numbers. That's what you were brought here for. The rest is hollow business, and hollow business stays in the hollow." Miss Marsh left the Riddle cabin that night feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. The stars were brilliant overhead, cold and distant. The creek whispered in the darkness, and somewhere in the woods an owl called, the sound echoing off the ridges like a question with no answer. She should leave. She knew it with absolute certainty. She should pack her bags, saddle her mule at first light, and ride out of this place before winter trapped her here. Whatever was happening in Hollow Creek, it was beyond her power to change or even fully comprehend. But the children, she kept thinking of their faces, of Ruth's bruised arms, of Samuel's limp, of the way they watched the woods with such terrible vigilance. She could not leave them. The legend tells us that on the 20th of November, a date that feels significant, though no one can say why everything changed. Miss Marsh woke in her small room at the back of the schoolhouse to the sound of voices. At first, in the confusion of interrupted sleep, she thought it was morning, time for school. But when she looked through her small window, she saw that it was still deep night. The moon hung low over the ridge, 3/4 full, casting silver light across the hollow. The voices were coming from outside, chanting, low and rhythmic, rising and falling like the sound of the creek itself. Miss Marsh dressed quickly, her hands shaking as she buttoned her dress. She took her kerosene lamp, lit it with trembling fingers, and moved through the dark schoolhouse toward the front door. When she eased it open, the cold hit her like a physical force. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and her breath formed clouds in the lamplight. The chanting was coming from the woods above the schoolhouse, up the slope where the trees grew thick. She could see lights moving between the trees, torches or lanterns, bobbing like willow, wisps through the darkness. Every instinct screamed at her to close the door, to return to her bed, to pull the quilts over her head and wait for dawn. But she thought of the children. Were they out there? Were they being subjected to some ritual she could not imagine? Miss Marsh stepped out into the November night. She followed the lights up the slope, her lamp held before her, her shoes slipping on the frost, slick leaves. The chanting grew louder as she climbed, and now she could make out words, or at least sounds that might have been words, though in no language or dialect she recognized. She emerged into a clearing perhaps 200 yards above the schoolhouse. The sight that met her eyes would, according to the legend, haunt her for whatever remained of her life. The entire community was there. All the adults of Hollow Creek, perhaps 20 in total, stood in a circle around a large flat rock that jutted from the ground like an altar. They held torches aloft, and in the flickering light their faces looked primitive, ancient, like the faces of people from some earlier age of the world. And in the center of the circle, standing on the rock, was a figure Miss Marsh did not recognize. An old woman, ancient, it seemed, though in the torchlight it was impossible to judge her age with accuracy. She wore a long dark dress that might have dated from the previous century, and her white hair hung loose around her shoulders. She held a staff carved with symbols that meant nothing to Miss Marsh, and it was her voice that led the chanting, rising and falling with a power that seemed to pull responses from the very air. The children were there too, all 13 of them, standing in a smaller circle inside the larger one, their hands joined, their faces upturned to the old woman with expressions of rapt attention. Miss Marsh stood at the edge of the clearing, frozen. She should have run. She should have fled back down the slope to the schoolhouse, gathered her things, and left this cursed place immediately. But she could not move. She could only watch as the ritual, for that was clearly what this was, continued. The old woman raised her staff toward the sky. The chanting ceased. In the sudden silence, the old woman's voice rang out, clear and strong despite her apparent age. The children of the Hollow must learn, she said. The old ways must not be forgotten. The compact must be kept. The price must be paid. Then she turned, and her eyes that gleamed like coins in the torchlight, fixed on Miss Marsh where she stood at the clearing's edge. "The stranger watches," the old woman said, and her voice was neither angry nor welcoming. It simply stated fact. Every head turned toward Miss Marsh, 20 adult faces, 13 children's faces, all watching her, all waiting to see what she would do. Miss Marsh found her voice. "What are you doing to these children?" Jonah's riddle stepped forward from the circle. "Go back to the schoolhouse, Miss Marsh. This doesn't concern you. These are my students. Everything that affects them concerns me. You teach them letters." Jonah said, and his voice was gentle, almost kind, "That's good. They need to know letters, but we teach them other things, things you can't understand. Then help me understand." Miss Marsh said, and was surprised by the strength in her own voice. "What is this? What are you teaching them?" The old woman spoke again. "Survival," she said simply. "We teach them to survive. The mountains take their price, stranger woman. They always have. They always will. We teach the children how to pay it, how to ensure that others pay it, how to keep the Hollow safe. I don't understand. No, The old woman agreed. You don't. Your people forgot the old ways long ago. You live in cities where the land is dead, paved over, where you've forgotten that everything has a price. We remember. We keep the compact. And the hollow survives. Miss Marsh felt something rising in her chest, anger, fear, and something else. Determination. Whatever you're teaching these children, it's hurting them. I've seen the bruises, the fear in their eyes. I won't allow it to continue. A murmur ran through the circle. Not threatening, but somehow sad. You won't allow it. The old woman's voice carried a note of something that might have been amusement. Child, you have no power here. You're a visitor, a guest, when winter comes, and it comes soon now. You'll be trapped in the hollow until spring, and by spring you'll either understand or— She trailed off, leaving the alternative unspoken. Or what? Or you'll be gone. Jonah's riddle said quietly. One way or another. Miss Marsh fled. She ran down the slope, her lamp swinging wildly, her breath coming in gasps that had nothing to do with the exertion. Behind her, the chanting resumed, following her down the mountain like a curse. She reached the schoolhouse and barricaded herself inside, pushing her desk against the door, knowing even as she did so that it was useless. If they wanted to reach her, no amount of furniture would stop them, but they did not come. The chanting continued for perhaps another hour, then faded away. The lights in the woods disappeared. Silence returned to Hollow Creek, broken only by the eternal whisper of the stream. Miss Marsh sat at her desk, the lamp burning low, and tried to think what to do. She should leave immediately. But it was the middle of the night, and the trail over the ridge was treacherous in daylight, potentially deadly in darkness. She would have to wait until dawn. Dawn came with aching slowness. When gray light finally began to filter through the windows, Miss Marsh gathered her belongings with shaking hands. She would take only what she could carry on her back: her clothes, her few books, her letters. The mule could carry the rest, or it could stay here. She didn't care. She only needed to escape. But when she opened the door, she found Jonah's riddle sitting on the steps, waiting. Going somewhere? He asked. I'm leaving, Miss Marsh said, and hated how her voice shook. Can't let you do that, Jonas said, still seated, his tone conversational. Not yet, anyway. Snow's coming, big storm, should be here by tomorrow night. Trail won't be passable. I don't care, I'm leaving. Jonas stood slowly. He was not a large man, but there was something implacable about him. Miss Marsh, you need to calm down and think clear. You saw something last night that frightened you. I understand that, but you don't understand what you saw, and if you leave now, frightened and confused, you'll tell stories in Grayson Falls, stories that will bring trouble to the Hollow. You're hurting those children. No, Jonas said, and there was genuine conviction in his voice. We're teaching them. There's a difference. Teaching them what? Some kind of witchcraft, superstition. Jonas smiled, and there was sadness in it. Miss Marsh, you're an educated woman. You probably think you know how the world works, but there are places, old places, places like this hollow where the rules are different, where the old powers still hold sway. We don't practice witchcraft. We practice survival. We make our offerings. We keep our compact. And the hollow survives year after year when other places fail and die. That's insane. Is it? Look around you, Miss Marsh. We have no blight. Our crops don't fail. Our children are healthy. When sickness comes to other places, it passes us by. When other hollows lose their young men to mine accidents and feuds, ours come home safe. That's not luck. That's the compact. And what does this compact require? What price do you pay? Jonas's face darkened. That's not something we discuss with outsiders. Miss Marsh felt her courage returning, fueled by anger. Then I will leave, and I will tell them in Grayson Falls. I'll tell them to send the sheriff. I'll tell them. You'll tell them nothing. Jonas interrupted, and now there was steel in his voice. "Because if you do, if you bring the outside world into the hollow, the compact will be broken, and when the compact breaks, the protection ends. All those children you're so worried about, they'll be at risk, real risk, the kind that can't be prevented by sheriffs and laws. Do you want that on your conscience?" Miss Marsh stared at him, trying to read his face, trying to determine if this was threat or genuine warning. She could not tell. "What do you want from me?" she finally asked. "Teach," Jonas said simply. "Teach the children their letters and numbers. Take your meals with the families. Stay through the winter, as you agreed to do. And don't interfere with what you don't understand. Come spring, if you still want to leave, you can go with our blessing. We'll even give you supplies for the journey. And if I refuse—" Jonas looked at her for a long moment. "Don't refuse," he said quietly. "Please." There was something in his voice, something that sounded almost like fear. That gave Miss Marsh pause. The snow came that night, just as Jonas had predicted. It fell thick and heavy, blanketing the hollow in white silence. By morning, the trail over the ridge had disappeared beneath 2 feet of snow, and more was falling. Miss Marsh was trapped. The legend becomes unclear at this point. Different versions tell different stories about what happened during that long winter in Hollow Creek. But certain elements remain constant across all tellings. Miss Marsh continued to teach. The children came to the schoolhouse each morning, their boots leaving tracks in the snow, their breath fogging in the cold air. She taught them reading and arithmetic and geography. She read to them from her books, and they learned, as children do, with varying degrees of enthusiasm and aptitude. But the other teaching continued too. She would see the lights in the woods on certain nights that seemed to follow some calendar she could not decipher. The chanting would rise from the slopes above the schoolhouse, and she would lie in her narrow bed, covers pulled tight, and try not to hear. The children changed subtly as the winter progressed. They became more confident, more assured. The fear she had sensed in them during her first weeks in the hollow began to fade, replaced by something else. A sense of purpose, perhaps, or acceptance, and Miss Marsh began to see things. At first, she told herself it was imagination, the product of isolation and stress. But the visions persisted. She would look out the schoolhouse window on moonlit nights and see figures moving through the snow, figures that did not quite have human shapes. She would wake from dreams of the ancient woman with her staff and her chanting, and find that the dream had left her with knowledge she had not possessed before, knowledge of plants and the properties of the movements of stars, of songs in languages she had never studied. Was she going mad? Or was she, despite herself, despite her fear and resistance, beginning to understand? February came, the deadest month, when the hollow lay buried under snow and ice, and the only sounds were the wind and the creek's muffled whisper. It was during February that little Ruth, the 6-year-old with the haunted eyes, approached Miss Marsh after school one day. "Miss Marsh," she said quietly. "Yes, Ruth. You're afraid of the teaching, aren't you, the night teaching?" Miss Marsh knelt to be at the child's eye level. "I don't understand it," she said carefully, "and yes, what I don't understand frightens me." Ruth nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. "Mama says you're a good teacher. She says you're kind. She says maybe we can help you understand." "I would like to understand, Ruth. Can you explain it to me?" The child bit her lip, thinking hard. Finally she said, "The hollow is alive, Miss Marsh. Not like people are alive, but alive, and it watches us. It protects us. But we have to give it things. We have to show we're part of it. We have to make the offerings." "What kind of offerings?" Ruth shook her head. "That's for the grown folks to say. But it's not bad, Miss Marsh. It's just necessary. like planting seeds in spring or storing food for winter. It's just what you have to do to survive here. Miss Marsh wanted to press further, but Ruth's mother appeared in the doorway, come to fetch her daughter home. The conversation ended there. March arrived with a false thaw, then more snow. April brought rain that turned the hollow into a sea of mud. And finally, in late April, true spring came to Hollow Creek. The snow melted from the ridges. Green returned to the trees. The creek ran high and clear with runoff. The trail over the ridge became passable again. One morning in early May, Miss Marsh packed her bags. The school year was ending. Her obligation to the hollow was fulfilled. It was time to leave. But as she prepared to depart, as she saddled her mule and tied her bags securely, she realized something that troubled her deeply. She did not want to leave. Over the long winter, something had changed in her. She had begun to feel, not acceptance exactly, not understanding, not really, but a sense that there were mysteries in the world deeper than she had imagined. That the hollow, for all its strangeness, possessed a kind of wisdom that her educated, rational mind had been too proud to acknowledge. And the children, she had grown to care for them deeply. Despite everything, despite the night rituals and the chanting and the old woman with her ancient ways, the children of Hollow Creek were good children. Bright children, children who deserved to learn and grow. Jonah's riddle approached as she was finishing her preparations. "So you're leaving," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." Miss Marsh said, as we agreed. "You could stay," Jonas said quietly. "Another year. The children have learned more from you than any teacher we've had. You've been good for them, and maybe—" he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe they've been good for you too." Miss Marsh looked at him, really looked at him, and she saw not a villain, not a monster, but a man trying to preserve a way of life that was slowly dying, trying to keep ancient knowledge alive in a world that was forgetting. "I need to think," she said finally. "I need to go to Grayson Falls to send letters to, process everything I've experienced here, but I won't tell stories. I won't bring authorities. You have my word on that." Jonas nodded slowly. "That's fair. And if you decide to come back in the fall, you'll welcome me. We'll welcome you." Miss Marsh rode out of Hollow Creek on a bright May morning, the sun warm on her face, the birds singing in the trees that lined the trail. She looked back once, from the top of the ridge, and saw the hollow laid out below her, the cabins, the creek, the schoolhouse standing in its small clearing. It looked peaceful, idyllic even, a place out of time. The legend ends here, or rather, it fragments into multiple endings, depending on who tells the story. In some versions, Miss Marsh went to the authorities in Grayson Falls. She told them everything: the rituals, the old woman, the strange teachings. A sheriff and several deputies rode into the hollow, determined to investigate these disturbing reports. They found nothing, no schoolhouse, no cabins, no people, just an empty valley with a creek running through it, as if Hollow Creek had never existed at all. And when they tried to lead Miss Marsh back to show her what they had found, she could not find the trail. The path she had followed in and out of the hollow had vanished, leaving only unbroken forest. In other versions, Miss Marsh kept her word. She told no one what she had seen. She lived quietly in Grayson Falls through the summer, teaching at the town school, writing long letters to friends that she never sent. And when September came, when the leaves began to turn and the air grew crisp, she packed her bags once more and rode back over the ridge into Hollow Creek. Whether she ever left again, these versions do not say. In still other versions, the darkest versions, whispered late at night,